They told the alien girl she was done and left her behind, but a human took her hand and stayed. A child's boot lay half buried in the dust, its plastic edges melted, sole fused to the ground like it had been pressed there by fire. Jace Ren Thorne crouched beside it, one gloved hand brushing away the fine, ash-like particles. It wasn't just debris. This was residue from orbital bombardment. Superheated atmospheric melt turned to drifting gray. He stood slowly, his breath clouding inside the cracked seal of his helmet. The moon was still bleeding even now. Low gravity made every movement deliberate. His boots whispered across the wreckage of the outpost. Metal groaned underfoot. The sky above was a bruised violet, stars blurred behind a web of charred cloud. The shuttle engines rumbled behind him. The last evac was almost complete, and she was still here. Mira Vex. Green-skinned, tall, motionless. She sat on the remains of a shattered hull panel, her back straight, her synthetic arm curled slightly over one knee. Black hair hung loose over her shoulders, tangled with ash. One eye was a dull, milky white, the other sharp and unreadable. She didn't turn when the evacuation officer passed by her, didn't flinch when he muttered, "Your service is appreciated. Your mission is complete." They left her there like a crate no one wanted to lift. She didn't argue. She didn't move. Jace watched from the ramp, his fingers curled around the edge of the hatch. He remembered her, months ago, cutting through an enemy mech with one blow. Back then she hadn't spoken much, but she didn't need to. When she moved, others followed. He remembered how she'd thrown herself into the line when a detonation breached the barracks wall. No hesitation, just calculation and fire. She bled silver from her arm and red from her scalp, and kept going. And now they had left her here like she was spent ammunition. She stood, limping slightly, and disappeared into the haze. Jace didn't move, not until the ramp began to close. He stepped back. "What the hell are you doing?" a voice barked. He didn't answer at first. His gaze stayed on the path she had taken. "Staying behind," he said finally. "We've still got unstable cores and unsecured tech down here. Someone's got to lock it all down before the next supply scan." The evacuation officer frowned. "Are you out of your mind? This place is done." He nodded once. "So's a lot of things." He walked away before they could order him back. The shuttle lifted, turbines screaming against the dying sky. The sound faded into distance, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Jace hiked toward the southern edge of the complex, into the old barracks district. Most of it had caved in, scorched and useless, but one storage sublevel remained intact enough to offer cover. He forced open a half-sealed hatch, light flickering inside. Not much, but it was warmer than the open sky. He unrolled his bivy sack, set up a cracked heater cell, and stripped out of his armor in layers. The moment the seal broke, he caught the bitter sting of the air, thin, dry, laced with something metallic. Rations, 3 weeks at half meals. Water, barely 9 days, unless he found filters that hadn't shattered in the quake. Power, limited to solar cells, if he could find panels not burned or stolen. And one bedroll. He laid it out on the cold floor. The first night passed without sound. No voices, no footsteps. Only the wind whispering through ruptured corridors. The second morning she was there again. Mira. She stood in the broken corridor across from him, watching from the shadow of a collapsed beam. Her synthetic fingers sparked faintly when she shifted her weight, but she said nothing. He didn't speak either, just tore open a ration pack, chewed a bite, then set another beside the fire drum without looking at her. He left it there and walked away. When he returned an hour later, it was gone. That night he caught a flicker of movement. Mira stood near the wrecked mess hall, arms folded, looking out at the stars. Her breath rose in small plumes. She wore no helmet, no mask. Her physiology must have been altered to tolerate the atmosphere, or she simply didn't care if it killed her slowly. Jace lowered himself beside the heater again, adjusting the panel angle. He clicked on his compad and played a soft melody from Earth. Something old, slow, wordless. A lullaby without meaning anymore. Her head turned slightly, just for a second. The third day brought wind, the kind that stirred dust into curtains across the floor and made the old structures creak like bones. Jace was inspecting a downed relay tower when a sudden chirp from his old wrist scanner froze him in place. Motion. Too fast, too precise. Not an animal. He ducked behind a support beam, fingers tightening on the grip of his sidearm. The red light flickered, then vanished. A shape moved in the haze, but it wasn't hostile. Mira stepped into view slowly, dragging a defunct power cell behind her. You set off the proximity trip, he said. She tilted her head. You should mark your wires better. It was the first time she spoke to him directly. Her voice was lower than he remembered, steady, dry, without tone. But it wasn't hostile. He raised an eyebrow. I'll make a note of it. She didn't respond. Just knelt and began stripping the cell's casing with mechanical precision. Sparks popped. Jace watched the way her hands moved. Fluent, practiced, beautiful, in a way she probably didn't even realize. That night, he found a second bedroll unfolded beside his. She didn't sleep near it, just left it there. The heater's glow cast faint green light across the floor. Jace lay down and closed his eyes. A minute passed, then another. And then he heard the quiet hiss of her synthetic joints as she settled beside the opposite wall. Not close, not far, just within reach. The silence between them felt different now. Not empty, not cold, just waiting. Jace didn't speak, but he kept his eyes open long enough to see her glance toward him. Once, no words, no thanks. But before she turned away, she nodded, barely. And for the first time since the war ended, he felt something shift inside his chest. A beginning, small, fragile, but real. And he stayed awake a little longer just to be sure it hadn't been a dream. The fire had burned low in the night. Ash settled in thin layers on everything, on the old steel beams above, on the rim of the heater, even along the edge of Jace's rolled-up bed. He stirred awake slowly, reluctant to open his eyes, not because of fatigue, but because of the silence. She was still there. Mira Vex hadn't moved much since he'd last seen her, sitting with her back against the wall, legs drawn in slightly, arms folded across her midsection. Her synthetic limb rested inert, but occasionally, a faint pulse of light flickered beneath the outer casing. She was watching the darkness, not him, but he could feel her awareness, quiet and constant, like the hum of a system that never shut off. Jace rubbed a hand over his face, skin dry from the recycled air. He stretched, pulled on his boots, and checked the heater's charge level. Red. It had maybe 2 hours left, assuming the solar panels outside hadn't been covered overnight by another layer of drifting ash. He didn't speak, neither did she. Instead, he pulled out 2 ration packs. The foil made a faint crinkle in the heavy stillness. He didn't toss hers this time, just set it down between them and began eating his own, chewing mechanically, staring at the cracked floor. After a long pause, Mira picked up hers. No thank you. No glance in his direction. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if tasting more than just food, measuring something. Later, they moved together without planning to. A silent mutual decision. The comms tower was their goal for the day, and they both knew it. Repairing it was the only way off this moon, if they even wanted to be found. The walk took them across the western quadrant of the colony ruins. The low gravity made the movement light, almost floating, but the fine dust and jagged debris turned every step into a calculated decision. Metal groaned beneath their weight. Old plating shifted beneath their boots. The world here wasn't dead. It was suspended, caught in the moment after collapse, but before reclamation. The tower loomed ahead, partially collapsed, its spire leaning like a drunk trying to stand upright in a windstorm. The reinforced base, however, had survived. Jace approached first, boots crunching softly as he circled the structure, eyes scanning for signs of instability. Mira trailed behind him, her eyes moving faster than his, picking up subtle power fluctuations, gaps in insulation, microfractures in the steel. He noticed the way she favored her right leg again, subtle but persistent. You recharged your leg joint? He asked, still not looking at her. She paused for a beat. Insufficient current. The actuator's degraded. Can probably splice something from the drone battery I pulled yesterday. I already tried. Voltage mismatch. He glanced at her then. Just a quick look. She wasn't lying. He could tell by the precise tone of her voice, the practiced neutrality. She had tried to fix it herself, probably alone in the dark long before he noticed. Inside the tower, they found old terminal racks and tangled coils of melted fiber. Useless. The damage had gone deeper than Jace expected. Still, he began sorting through the wreckage, salvaging anything that still held a charge. Mira moved silently beside him. Efficient, her synthetic hand pulled apart casings like paper. Where he struggled with rusted components, she found alternate paths, rerouted circuits. There was no conversation, only the sound of breathing, the distant wind, and the occasional soft ping of metal striking metal. Then the warning chirp sounded. At first, it was faint, a proximity alert left behind by someone who thought the system had died long ago. Jace stiffened. Mira froze. From the far wall, a dormant defense drone stirred to life. Its shell was blackened, one side caved in, but the targeting lens flickered red as it activated. It moved like a dying animal, jerky, inefficient, but still dangerous. Jace pulled his sidearm without thinking. The drone spun toward the movement. Mira dropped into a low crouch, fluid as breath, and raised her left arm. A faint blue shimmer rippled across her synthetic forearm as it absorbed the drone's first shot. Jace fired twice. The drone stumbled, but its core was still active. Sparks trailed from its undercarriage as it accelerated toward them. Mira didn't flinch. She surged forward, using the moon's gravity to launch herself low, twisting as she drove her arm into the drone's side. A crunch of metal, a burst of smoke, then silence. The machine collapsed, twitching once, then went still. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tower seemed to inhale around them. Then Mira stepped back. Her arm sparked once weakly, then fell limp to her side. "You all right?" Jace asked quietly. She nodded. Core pulse backlash, temporary. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and took her arm, carefully, just above the wrist. The casing was hot. He didn't pull or press, just steadied it in his hand. Mira didn't draw away. They stood like that for several seconds. No words, just a contact point between human and not quite. Her gaze flicked briefly to his face. He met it, but didn't hold it. After a beat, he released her and stepped back, kneeling beside the drone wreckage. "Battery's intact," he muttered. "Might be able to repurpose the regulator." She didn't respond, but she moved to help him without prompting. That evening, the light began to fade early. Ash drifted thicker than before, like a storm brewing somewhere out of sight. Inside the shelter, Jace prepared their food. Mira was seated nearby, shoulder resting against the wall, face shadowed. Her damaged arm lay across her lap, wires still exposed. Jace wanted to offer to repair it, but something told him not to. Not yet. She'd let him touch it once. That was enough. For now. She broke the silence. That drone wasn't part of the standard defense grid. Number looked modified, field-rigged. "Someone stayed here after the evacuation, or came back later," he said. They both knew what that meant. Scavengers, or worse. Mira leaned her head back, eyes closed. "If someone else is here, they haven't triggered the sensors. Yet." She nodded. The room fell quiet again. This time it wasn't heavy, just still. Jace finished eating, then slid the second meal over. Mira picked it up without looking. She ate in silence. Halfway through, she slowed. Her shoulders eased a little. When the fire burned lower and the cold crept in, she reached toward the edge of her bedroll, paused, then moved it slightly closer to his. He didn't react, just lay back, eyes open, watching the ceiling. Eventually, she lay down, her arm between them, not touching, but near enough to feel. He could hear her breathing. It was calm, measured, and for the first time since they'd met, he thought she might actually be asleep. He stayed awake a while longer, listening to the soft hum of her mechanical systems, the faint rattle of wind outside, the irregular thump of a metal panel somewhere shifting against itself. It wasn't safety, not yet. But it wasn't isolation either, and sometimes that was enough to keep breathing. Jace awoke to the hum of static and the faint rhythm of breathing that wasn't his own. Not snoring, not mechanical, just quiet, measured, steady, like someone trying not to be heard and forgetting no one else was listening. Mira was still asleep or something close to it. Her body remained still except for the occasional twitch in her synthetic arm, which flickered faintly with low-energy pulses. Her face, softened in the dim firelight, seemed a little less guarded in sleep. It was strange how quickly the silence between them had changed. At first it had felt like a barrier. Now it held weight, a presence, not a void. Jace shifted carefully, trying not to wake her. His muscles ached from the cold floor, and a slow throb pulsed behind his left temple. The recycled air had dried out his sinuses again. He rubbed at his brow, then pushed himself upright. The fire had died to embers. He grabbed the last fuel cell, slotted it into the burner, and pressed the ignition. Heat licked the space between them again. Mira stirred but didn't open her eyes. He went about his morning in silence, checking the solar battery levels, inspecting the motion sensors they'd rigged from old security drones. No breaches, no footprints, just wind and dust. Still, The unease from yesterday's encounter with the drone hadn't faded. Someone had modified that machine. It wasn't military issue anymore. Someone had stayed behind or come after the evacuation. Someone who knew enough to rewire autonomous defense tech. When he returned to the shelter, Mira was sitting up, arms loosely draped over her knees. Her synthetic limb looked less strained after the night's rest, but the casing still showed deep scoring. "You need to reroute the power," he said as he knelt beside her. "Your left arm's bleeding current." "I know," she replied. He waited a beat, then gently reached for it. "May I?" She didn't answer, but she didn't stop him either. He unlatched the exterior panel, revealing a nest of fiber and alloy nerves beneath. She turned her head as he worked, but her breathing never changed. Jace focused, careful not to touch her actual skin. The proximity was close, intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with romance. It was about trust, and that between them was still fragile. "Your relay lines are burnt out," he murmured. "I can swap in a segment from the drone we scavenged." "I already checked its wiring, too corroded." He nodded. "Then I'll scavenge from the environmental scrubber next door. No one's breathing through it anyway." Mira glanced at him for a brief moment. Not quite approval. Something more neutral. Curiosity, maybe. "You were a soldier," she said. "Yes. Not an engineer. I learned, after I stopped trusting command to fix things for me." That made her pause. He left to salvage the part, boots crunching over powdered debris. The old scrubber unit had collapsed inward, but its central node remained intact. Pulling it loose took time and effort, enough to make his arms ache. But eventually, he returned with a replacement wire wrapped around his wrist. Back inside, Mira sat where he'd left her, gaze distant. When he crouched to finish the repair, she didn't flinch. But her voice was quieter than before. "This moon," she said. "I fought here a year ago. The battle lasted 3 days. I was dropped in with a team of 7, only I came back." Jace paused mid-connection. "I remember hearing about that. The mines collapsed. Power grid failed. Friendly fire from orbital." He looked up at her. "That was you?" Her face was impassive. "What remained of me?" He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Finished the repairs, closed the casing, stepped back. Mira flexed her fingers experimentally. The limb responded without resistance. A slow, subtle nod acknowledged his work. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time. He didn't respond right away, just gave her a quiet look and stood. "We should scout the eastern corridor. If someone's been modifying drones, they had to get power from somewhere." They moved out together. The ashfall was lighter today, the sky above dim but cloudless. Their breath came in thin puffs, curling before fading. The corridor ahead was narrower. Collapsed beams forced them to walk single file. Mira took point this time, her steps slow but sure. Halfway through, she stopped, crouched, touched something. "Footprints," she said. Jace came up beside her. They were faint but clear, human-shaped, recent. "Not ours," he said. "No," she agreed. They tracked them to a side structure, an old processing unit turned storage bay. The door was ajar. Inside, faint warmth lingered. Someone had been here, but they were gone now. Jace scanned the space while Mira moved with silent efficiency, checking crates and tech stacks. A datapad sat near the back wall, still warm, still powered. Mira reached for it, then froze. Her eyes narrowed. Booby-trapped. Jace saw it a second later, fine wire glinting along the edge, rigged to a pressure switch beneath the pad. Not military grade, crude, homemade, but deadly all the same. Mira disarmed it with calm precision, fingers moving with surgical grace. When it clicked free, she handed it to Jace. The screen flickered to life. The interface was old but readable. Most of the logs were junk, encrypted chatter, sensor readings. But the last entry caught his eye. "Still no signal from orbit. Power core's degrading. Drone patrols active. One of them saw me today. I think it wasn't alone." Mira read over his shoulder. "Someone was watching us." Jace nodded, the weight of it settling into his chest. Someone's still out there, maybe watching now. They didn't speak after that. Not until they were back at the shelter, sealing the door behind them, resetting the motion grid with double range. That night, Jace sat across the fire from her, turning the datapad over in his hands. Mira stared into the flame, its light catching the sharp lines of her face. She looked tired, but in the way soldiers look tired. Worn down, not weak. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. "I know." "Then why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back against the wall and exhaled slowly. Because I've seen what happens to people when they're left behind, and I couldn't let it happen again. She turned her gaze to him, searching, not challenging. You lost someone. Yes. She didn't ask who, and he didn't offer. But when he finally lay down, Mira didn't wait until the fire burned low to move her bedroll closer. This time, it was only a breath away. And when he drifted into sleep, he realized something had shifted between them. Not broken open, but softened. A tension no longer being held, a distance no longer guarded. Tomorrow would bring new threats, that much was certain. But for tonight, they had shared silence. And sometimes that was enough. The fire had burned low, casting weak orange light across the cracked floor and battered walls of the reactor shelter. Jace sat awake, his back against the cold metal, his eyes half closed but his senses sharp. Mira was sleeping beside him. She hadn't twitched tonight, no sudden jerks of her synthetic arm, no short, sharp gasps for air. Instead, her body was relaxed, her breathing slow and steady, like she had finally, after all these nights, let the weight slide off her shoulders. Jace turned his head slightly to watch her. Strands of black hair fell across her forehead, softening the sharp angles of her face. The thin scar that crossed her cheek caught the dying firelight, a ghost of violence long past. Her hand, the organic one, rested lightly over the edge of his blanket, as if some part of her, even in sleep, needed that small connection. For the first time since he'd stayed behind, Jace allowed himself to hope. Not for a rescue, not even for survival. For something rarer, that she had found a sliver of peace. He shifted carefully, pulling the blanket higher over her without waking her, then leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Morning came gray and silent. When Jace woke, Mira was already up, moving around the shelter with silent efficiency, checking the power cells and the filtration system. He sat up and stretched, wincing at the stiffness in his joints. "Morning," he said, voice rough with sleep. She gave a slight nod but said nothing. He watched her for a moment, how she moved. Not the rigid, alert precision of a soldier expecting an ambush, but the fluid, almost casual motions of someone who trusted her environment, at least for now. After breakfast, ration packs and a shared thermos of barely warm coffee, they sat together by the open terminal, recalibrating the external sensors. It was Mira who broke the silence first. "You fixed my arm the night you stayed behind," she said, her voice quiet but direct. Jace glanced at her. "You needed it. I had the parts. You could have salvaged them for yourself." "I didn't stay behind for salvage," he said. A pause. "Then why?" she asked, her gaze meeting his, steady and unflinching. He set down the damaged connector he'd been working on. His hands rested on his knees as he exhaled slowly. "I had a sister," he said, "Lena. When the Corothians attacked the Outer Belts, she was stationed at Vesta Ridge, civilian tech division, no heavy weapons, no training for a real fight." Mira said nothing, but her posture shifted slightly, leaning closer. "They promised reinforcements, promised extraction." He smiled bitterly. The promises meant nothing. Command pulled everyone they thought mattered and left the rest to die. He rubbed the back of his neck, the memory sharp and heavy. "I wasn't there, couldn't reach her, couldn't even say goodbye. All I got was a transmission, her last message, glitching through static. She said ... He paused, swallowing hard. "She said she wasn't afraid to die, only afraid of being forgotten." Mira looked away then, her jaw tightening. "That's why I stayed," Jace said. "I wasn't going to watch someone else disappear like that, not again." The silence between them thickened, heavier than before, but different, not oppressive, full. Mira's hand tightened slightly around the tool she was holding. "You don't owe me anything," she said, voice low. "It's not about owing," he replied. "It's about choosing." She let that settle between them, her breathing slow and measured. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I wasn't born. I was built." He didn't flinch at the words. He only listened. "I was printed at Delta 9, she continued. VX series, advanced infiltration prototypes. I was Unit 7. We weren't given names. We weren't even given full memories. Just enough knowledge to fight and adapt." She shifted, staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in her good eye. "I earned my name during a failed extraction. A human officer, Captain Vex, dragged me out of a collapsing compound. Misread my tag and called me Mira. It was the first time anyone ever called me something that wasn't a number." What happened to him? Jace asked gently. She pressed her lips together. He died 2 missions later. Shielded me from a blast he couldn't survive. Jace inhaled deeply, the ache in his chest sharpening. Mira went on, her voice steady but stripped of all pretense. After that I fought. Missions blurred together. I was efficient, valuable. Until this moon. Until the operation that failed. I came back broken. They called it decommissioning. I call it what it was, abandonment. Jace reached out, not to fix, not to rescue, but to connect. He touched her hand lightly, the organic one. She didn't pull away. I'm not leaving you behind, he said. I'm not a mission, she replied. I know. A faint tremor ran through her fingers before she curled them around his hand, anchoring herself. Outside, the thin light of the distant sun began to seep through the cracks in the shelter walls. Mira looked at him, truly looked, without shields, without defenses. You see me, she whispered. Yes, he said, and I'm staying. There was no grand declaration, no kiss, no cinematic crescendo. Just 2 survivors, battered and tired, choosing, deliberately, stubbornly, not to be alone anymore. That afternoon they worked side by side, repairing the damaged external antenna array, reinforcing the reactor seals. Mira laughed once when Jace slipped and nearly tumbled into a heap of old wiring. It was a small sound, rusty and uncertain but real. He grinned back at her without embarrassment, his heart lighter than it had been in years. When evening came, they sat by the fire again, eating a crude stew Mira had crafted from hydroponic roots and ration seasoning. She bumped her shoulder lightly against his as she passed him a cup. You're terrible at cooking, she teased, deadpan. You're no prize either, he shot back with a grin. Her smile flickered again, and for once she didn't hide it. The stars began to emerge beyond the broken dome, cold, ancient, but somehow less distant than before. Jace stretched out beside the fire, arms folded behind his head. Mira hesitated for a second before lying down next to him, her head close enough that their breath mingled in the cooling air. They said nothing more that night. They didn't need to. Their scars hadn't disappeared. Their past hadn't been erased. But for the first time, those things didn't define them. The silence around them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something fragile and human. Hope. And this time, neither of them would face it alone. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a sky as pale as bone and a world cloaked in silence. Ash clung to the battered colony structures in new layers, softening their jagged silhouettes like snow on a graveyard. The wind had scoured the main path clear again, but it brought with it something else, a stillness that wasn't peace. Jace woke first. Mira was already sitting upright, her expression unreadable as always, but her body more alert than usual, tense in subtle ways he'd come to recognize. Her synthetic arm rested across her lap, the fingertips twitching slightly, running diagnostics she hadn't initiated. Something had shifted. We're being watched, she said. He nodded. He'd felt it too. Not with his eyes, but in the way the air pressed in, the way every sound carried just a little too far. Breakfast was short, quiet, no conversation. They didn't waste energy pretending things were fine. Jace ran a quick sweep of their motion perimeter, found a single disruption, barely perceptible. Someone had tested their sensors and retreated. A probe, maybe, or a warning. We moved to the sub-reactor chamber, Mira said as she packed her gear. Thicker walls, one entrance, easier to defend. I know the way, Jace replied. By mid-morning, they were on the move. Packs slung over shoulders, weapons loaded, not for scavenging, but for confrontation. The path to the reactor chamber wound through a collapsed maintenance tunnel where light came in sharp beams through holes in the ceiling. The farther they went, the colder it got. About halfway through, Jace stumbled, just a little. A chunk of floor plating had bent up at an angle and his boot caught it. He righted himself, but not before his knee struck the edge hard enough to buckle him. Damn it, he muttered, catching himself on one hand. Mira turned quickly, her eyes narrowing. Injury? No break, he said through clenched teeth. Just bone met steel. Let me see. He started to wave her off, but stopped. She crouched beside him, opened a side pouch on her belt and pulled out a med strip. Her fingers moved with clinical precision, cutting through the fabric of his pants just enough to reveal the swelling. She didn't speak while she worked. Just cleaned the skin, pressed the strip into place, and checked the range of motion with a few gentle adjustments. You'll bruise. No tendon damage, she said. Thanks, he muttered. Mira didn't stand immediately. She lingered there for a breath, her hand still near his knee, eyes flicking up to meet his. I don't want to lose you, she said softly. Jace blinked. It wasn't the words that struck him. It was the way she said them. Not like a confession, but a statement of logic, of truth. You won't, he replied. They reached the subreactor chamber by early afternoon. It was more intact than most structures, reinforced before the bombings. Dust lined the floor, but the system still showed traces of power. They sealed the door, ran checks, set up their perimeter again, then waited. The silence stretched, longer than usual. Mira cleaned her arm, recalibrated her sensors. Jace patched his sleeve and scanned frequencies, but neither spoke for hours. Not because they had nothing to say, but because everything they might say now meant something. As night fell, the cold crept in hard and fast. Their heater cell flickered, power dipping more than it should have. Jace tapped the panel, frowning. This thing's dying, Mira looked over. The cell's cracked. Could have happened in the storm, he sighed. We'll freeze by morning if it drops again. I generate some residual heat, Mira said. He arched an eyebrow. That an offer? She held his gaze. Yes. He nodded slowly, unsure of whether to feel touched or terrified by the clinical certainty in her voice. When he sat beside her, their shoulders brushed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she shifted carefully, settling her weight against his side. Her head rested just beneath his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He just wrapped an arm around her. Not possessive, just protective, human. You're warm, she said. You're not as cold as I expected. I'm not as much machine as they think. His fingers tightened slightly against her arm. I never thought you were. Minutes passed. Her breathing slowed. Then she spoke again, barely above a whisper. I used to pretend the stars had voices. When I was a child, not yet deployed, I'd lie in my chamber and imagine them whispering. Not words, just presence. Jace let that sit. Now sometimes I wonder if I made that up, if they ever spoke to me at all. They did, he said. I think they still do. She tilted her face toward his, and for a second, the space between them held more than warmth. He didn't move to kiss her, but he didn't need to. She let her head rest against his chest, and her hand curled loosely around the edge of his jacket. A sound echoed outside. Both of them stiffened. Not wind, not debris, footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. They both reached for their weapons without a word. Mira slipped away from him, crouched low, her synthetic arm already charging a soft pulse at her palm. Jace moved to the console, cut the lights. The room dropped into shadows. They held their breath. The door hissed softly, not opening, just pressure adjusting. Then silence. Something out there knew where they were. It wasn't coming in yet, but it would. Jace felt Mira's hand brush his shoulder once, steady, not panicked, just present. We hold here tonight, she whispered. We survive, together. He nodded. And beneath the threat, beneath the chill, beneath the unknown, there was something else. A flicker, a pulse, not of machines, not of defense protocols, of something human, something whole. Tomorrow they might bleed, but tonight they were not alone. And in a place built for war and silence, that meant everything. The night didn't bring sleep, not truly. Jace lay on his side, staring at the ceiling, feeling Mira's breathing steady beside him, the faint warmth of her synthetic arm brushing his shoulder. The reactor room was quiet except for the occasional hum of the improvised heating system. Outside, something waited, unseen but undeniable. They hadn't spoken about it aloud, but they both knew. Someone was out there, watching, testing their defenses. At some point in the early hours, Jace had gotten up and rechecked the perimeter sensors for the third time. Still nothing concrete, just brief flickers, low heat signatures, too erratic for local wildlife and too cautious for mindless drones. Whoever it was, they weren't moving randomly. Back inside, Mira was awake, sitting at the far wall with her back straight and her legs drawn in. She had been monitoring the communication relay. Her fingers danced over the control pad, her expression unreadable. Jace crouched beside her. Anything? A faint echo, she said. Fragmented signal. Possibly Federation, possibly bait. He peered at the waveform on the screen. It was broken, but the rhythm, it was familiar. Old military frequency, out of use but still embedded in deep code protocols. You think it's real? I think someone wanted it to be found. She adjusted the dish outside through the remote interface, angling it higher toward the remnants of the orbital debris net. A short burst of response code followed, then silence. "We won't know unless we wait," she said. He looked at her face, focused, calm, but tense around the eyes. Mira didn't let fear show easily. That made it more dangerous when it finally did. They spent the next few hours preparing, not for rescue, for confrontation. The defense grid was reset, power rerouted to the reinforced doorway, emergency kits packed into 2 field bags. Mira recharged the capacitor in her arm. Jace cleaned and loaded the remaining rounds into his rifle, checking each one with quiet ritual. "Do we hold or move?" he asked. Mira glanced toward the shadows outside the door. "If we hold, they'll force us out eventually, starve us, box us in. If we move, we're exposed." She nodded. "We need leverage." Jace's eyes settled on the signal monitor. "If that's a rescue ship, maybe we don't have to win, just survive long enough to be found." That was when the first motion alert triggered. A sharp beep cut through the silence. Red light blinked on the panel. Jace grabbed his weapon. Mira was already moving, fluid and silent, her arm charged with pale blue light. The camera feed flickered. 3 figures, low-slung and heavily armored, were breaching from the north corridor. One of them carried an ion cutter. They weren't here to scavenge. "They're professionals," Mira said, eyes narrowing. "Not locals." Jace checked the outer wall. "They've mapped our power layout. They'll hit the weak points first." She was already moving to intercept. "Wait," Jace said. "We don't split. I'll draw them. You reinforce the secondary hatch. If they get past me, you catch them in crossfire." Their eyes locked. He wanted to argue, but she was right. That didn't make it easier. She touched his shoulder, brief, firm, and grounding. "I come back." Then she was gone into the hallway. Jace moved fast, barricading the secondary entrance and rigging the panel with a low-yield explosive charge. Nothing fatal, just enough to stun or disorient. He heard the first exchange down the corridor. Mira's pulse shot hissing, followed by shouts and the hard clang of armor hitting steel. He gritted his teeth and kept working. One of the assailants came through the side entrance minutes later, as predicted. Jace fired first, 2 shots to the leg, 1 to the chest plate. The man dropped, groaning, alive but out of the fight. Jace moved forward, fast, silent, then silence again. Too much of it. He ran down the corridor, heart pounding, turned the corner. Mira was down on one knee, panting. One of her attackers lay crumpled beside her, his visor shattered, smoke still rising from his chest plate. Another had fled, blood trailing behind. Jace rushed to her side. "You're hurt." "Shoulder," she said, short of breath. "Armor caught most of it." He helped her sit, inspecting the damage. Her synthetic arm sparked at the joint, metal bent, casing cracked. "I can fix it," he said. "I know." She looked at him, sweat streaking soot down her cheek. "You weren't supposed to come after me." "I'm not leaving you alone out there." She blinked slowly, and for once her voice softened to something almost breakable. "I didn't want to lose you." "You didn't." He wrapped her good arm around his shoulder and lifted her carefully. Together, they hobbled back toward the central room. The signal monitor was blinking. Jace stared. An incoming transmission, not static, not a ghost. The morning came in low light, diffused through ash and frost clinging to the remnants of the dome. A distant rumble stirred the silence, faint at first, then rising in pitch. Not thunder, not tectonic movement, engines. Jace stood on the cracked landing platform, boots planted in gray dust. The signal had come through hours ago. A Federation vessel, inbound, real coordinates, real voices, rescue. He didn't move as the ship broke through the haze, its silhouette sharp against the sky. The hull was clean, too clean. The kind of sterile precision that didn't belong on a ruined moon like this. Its landing gear flared, dust spiraling as it touched down with surgical smoothness. Behind him, Mira stepped onto the platform without a word. She stood beside him, her synthetic arms slack at her side, the other brushing her jacket collar closed against the wind. Her face was calm, unreadable. But Jace had come to know her well enough to see the tension beneath her stillness. The way her stance shifted a fraction forward, like she was ready to run or ready to stay. The ship's hatch opened with a hiss of pressure release. 2 figures descended first, Federation officers in polished white and gray, their gear immaculate, expressions neutral. The third was a medic, already scanning for biosigns. They didn't look like people who had crawled through ash. "Lieutenant Thorne," the lead officer called, his voice crisp. "Jace Renthorne, confirm your identity." Jace nodded slowly. "Confirmed." The officer stepped closer. "We picked up your signal through a relay distortion web. You were marked MIA 5 months ago." "Longer," Jace muttered. "Feels like longer." The officer's gaze shifted to Mira, his mouth tightened barely. His eye darted to her synthetic arm, her scar, her non-human features. "She is?" "I'm Mira Vex," she said before Jace could speak. Her voice was calm, clear. "VX-7, Delta 9 origin, tactical field designation, decommissioned." The word hung in the air like a charge. Jace's jaw tensed. He turned toward the officer. "She's not decommissioned anymore. She's my partner." The officer blinked but said nothing. He looked at the medic who tapped his wristband. "Vitals strong. Biometrics irregular. Not in current registry." "She wasn't supposed to be here," the officer said. "She should have been extracted, or left." "She was left," Jace said. "By you." A pause. Then, as if it settled something in him, the officer took a step back. "We can get you both off this moon. Debrief will happen en route. You'll be quarantined, then reassigned. She won't be anything," Jace cut in. "She stays with me." Mira's eyes didn't move from the ship. "You'd be given full reinstatement," the officer said slowly. "A post, clean slate, Earthside privileges." Jace turned to Mira. "Do you want that?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched the ship, the officers, then drifted toward the distant skyline, the collapsed towers, the broken machines, the makeshift antenna they had built together from wreckage. This place had nearly killed her. But it had also given her back something she'd never known before. A choice. "I used to think survival was everything," she said quietly. "That if I kept functioning, I was winning." Jay said nothing. He just waited. "But surviving and living, they're not the same." She looked at him, her face no longer blank. It was full of something fragile, something terrifying. "I'm alive with you." He stepped toward her, close but not pressing. "You don't have to prove anything. Not to them, not to me." She reached for his hand, not because she needed balance, not because she was weak, but because this time she chose to touch him. "I know." The officer cleared his throat. "You're sure you won't come?" Mira met his gaze. "I was discarded once. I won't volunteer for it again." Jace looked back at the ship. Its hatch remained open, waiting. They could walk in right now, leave this moon behind, go back to air that didn't choke, heat that didn't flicker, food that didn't come in rations. But they wouldn't. Jace turned to the officer. "Thank you for coming, but we're staying." A pause. Then the officer gave a short nod. "Understood." The group turned, wordlessly returning to the ship. As the hatch sealed and the thrusters powered up, Mira and Jace stood unmoving, watching the vessel lift into the sky. It vanished beyond the ash clouds, the sound fading behind it like the last breath of another life. Only when silence returned did Mira finally exhale. They didn't speak as they walked back toward the shelter. The sky had begun to clear, faint shafts of light bleeding through, illuminating the path ahead. At the greenhouse, the first rows of hydroponic stalks had started to bud. Mira brushed her fingers over one leaf. It trembled just slightly, then held. Inside, the fire still smoldered. Jace added fuel. Mira set down her gear, unstrapped her jacket, and sat close beside him. There was no ceremony, no dramatic proclamation. He reached for her hand again, and she didn't let go. They watched the fire grow together, flames dancing in their eyes. Not survivors anymore, not fugitives, not lost, just two souls who had refused to abandon each other. On a ruined moon where no one thought love could grow, it had. Quietly, completely, and for the first time there was no war left to fight. Only the future, together. The moon had warmed, not in temperature. It was still bitter at night, and the mornings required breath-warmed gloves and layers over layers. But in rhythm, in routine, in the steady, lived-in texture of each new day. There were no alarms now, no motion sensors blinking red, no plasma pulses tearing through steel. Only the soft hum of the solar panels soaking in daylight, and the faint rustle of hydro-grown leaves in their reclaimed greenhouse. Mira stood in the filtered light, barefoot on the metal flooring, her hands deep in soil she had once thought she'd never touch. She was humming again, something slow and tuneless, and almost melodic. Jace had stopped asking what it meant. He just listened now, as one listens to rain tapping against old window panes. She was wearing one of his old shirts. It hung loose on her frame, sleeves rolled, collar slightly torn. He had once joked that it looked better on her. She hadn't replied, but she'd worn it every third day since. From the doorway, Jace watched her for a long moment. He'd been cleaning the internal water lines, but his hands had gone still the second he saw her standing there, with her head tilted back and her eyes closed, face catching light that filtered through the dome. She looked so unguarded, so entirely real. He walked forward, slow and careful, not wanting to break the quiet. She heard him, of course. She always did. But she didn't move away, not anymore. "You missed breakfast," he said gently. "I was watching them bloom." She motioned to the leafy stalks rising from nutrient foam. That one. The purple one. It shouldn't be alive here. And yet. He stepped beside her, leaned slightly to touch the edge of the strange, curled leaf. "Maybe it heard you humming." Her mouth curved. "Then I should do it more often." They stood there in silence, bodies close but not touching. The warmth between them was no longer cautious. It simply was. Jace turned to her. "I've been thinking about building a second water line, deeper in, maybe clear out the south wing and make it livable." Mira arched a brow. "Planning to expand? Planning to stay?" She looked at him, really looked, and in her gaze was something wordless and deep. Then, after a long pause, she said, "There was a time I didn't believe in staying." "I know." Another pause. "And now?" Mira reached out, slow and deliberate, her real hand settling on his chest, just over his heart. She felt its steady beat beneath her palm, and something in her expression cracked, softened. She said it quietly, like it had been growing inside her for days, weeks, maybe years. "I love you." It wasn't dramatic. There was no swell of music, no echo, just truth spoken in the kind of voice that only comes when someone has stopped being afraid of being broken. Jace didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned into her hand, then covered it with his own. His thumb brushed the thin bones of her wrist, her scarred skin, her warmth. "I love you too," he said. No hesitation, no condition. She smiled then. Not the small, ironic curve she used in place of emotions she didn't know how to name, but something real, open, free. They stood like that for a long time, two soldiers in a world without war. Two remnants who had refused to rust. Two people who had been broken, bent, weaponized, and still found their way back to themselves. Later that day, they shared lunch in the sunroom they'd patched together from broken glass and fusion tape. Mira leaned against him as they ate, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. He told her about a dream he'd had, something about rain on earth and the smell of wild grass. She told him she dreamed in color now, and sometimes the colors made music. As the day faded, they walked the perimeter hand in hand, boots scuffing the dusty path. There was no need to guard it anymore. They just liked the way it felt to walk together. That night, as stars pierced the dome above, they curled into their bedrolls, no longer apart, no longer pretending to keep walls between them. Mira fell asleep first, her breath slowing into the rhythm of deep rest. Jace lay awake a little longer, just watching her, the firelight tracing the soft lines of her face, the ease in her jaw, the peace in her fingers. He whispered it again, so quietly that only the walls could hear. "I love you." And for the first time in his life, the words didn't feel like surrender. They felt like home.